Good morning, good afternoon, wherever in the world you are. Welcome to this program. My name is Wilbert Mukori. I recently wrote an article just commenting on a comment made by somebody else, Peter Gift Mutasa. And this has generated so much stick that I wish to follow up on it. The comment Peter was basically saying that MDC or Triple C is not a perfect opposition party, but they're doing their best to fight this Zanu PF dictatorship, and we should all support them. One of the weaknesses in Zimbabwe society today, in my view, is ignorance and stupidity. These have become so intricate that people are refusing to learn from the past. I find it outrageous that people like Peter should be making such an outrageous statement. Zimbabwe has been independent for the last 43 years. And we are in this mess because for the last 43 years, we have failed to learn from our own mistakes. And therefore, then to be keeping on repeating the same mistake beggars belief. I find if this is the same Peter Gift Mutasa, I assumed it is the same. He is well known to most Zimbabweans. He was the president of the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions. And at the present moment, he is he's holding office in Crisis Zimbabwe, a very influential body, civic organization in Zimbabwe. These are the opinion makers in Zimbabwe. And I expect people like him to be better informed. If people like him are ignorant and stupid, I don't mean this to be in any insultive way, but being bluntly honest, then what more of my aunt and my uncle in the rural backwaters? This is what is so infuriating. Zimbabwe has been independent for the last 43 years. And in that period, it took us 20 years before most people finally realized and accepted that Robert Mugabe and his Zanu PF colleagues are not the glorious liberation heroes who can do nothing wrong. They want the people expected them to be. It took 20 years for that reality to finally, the penny to finally drop. people finally accepted that Robert Mugabe and his Zanu PF were corrupt, incompetent, and murderous thugs. And so by the late 1990s, the people of Zimbabwe came to the consensus that if they're going to have any meaningful change in the country, we needed to implement democratic reforms that will restore the individual freedoms and rights of all the citizens of the country. It was a significant point. And the resulting political activity were in response to that consensus decision. When Morgan Tsvangirai and his friends launched their movement for democratic change, they were riding on that wave of popular demand for democratic change. And so since 1999, when the movement for democratic change was launched, to this day, many Zimbabweans have risked life and limb to vote MDC/CCC into power for the express purpose that they would deliver the democratic changes the nation was dying for. And you would think somebody like Peter Mtasa, who, as president of ZCTU, had his finger on the political pulse of the country, would know that in the last 23 years, the MDC have failed to implement even one meaningful democratic change. Not even one meaningful democratic change. We can't, therefore, be arguing that CCC are not perfect, but they are doing their best to fight the Zanu PF dictatorship. What best are you talking about? They had 23 years, including 5 in the government of national unity of 2008 to 2013. And they failed to implement even one meaningful democratic change. Are we being realistic here? The truth of the matter is, MDC leaders had the golden opportunity to implement the democratic reforms during the GNU. They failed to do so. That is a fact, a historic fact. And anyone who has a finger on the pulse of the political pulse of the country should know that and acknowledge it, and not try to deny it and bury their heads in the sand. We need to acknowledge those things. If you made a mistake during the GNU, you didn't understand it. By now, with the benefit of hindsight, we should all be on one page on that point. MDC leaders betrayed the people of Zimbabwe by failing to implement reforms. That is a historic fact. So to keep on wittering about, oh, they're doing their best, is nonsensical. What is worse, ever since the GNU, MDC leaders have been participating in these flawed elections, knowing fully well that the process is flawed, that by participating, they're giving Zanu PF legitimacy, that they continue to do so out of greed. What is even more interesting here is that the MDC leaders themselves acknowledge this fact. And people like Peter cannot pretend they do not know that. This is a well-known fact. Here is a quotation from Tendai Biti in 2015, where he was admitting that participating in these flawed elections was absolutely nonsensical. It didn't make any sense at all. And I'm sure that he tried to talk his fellow opposition members into stopping participating in these flawed elections without reforms. But when he realized they would not listen, he gave up and joined them. And why were they not listening? Well, here's David Coulthard explaining why they were not listening. This is a quotation of David Coulthard's book, where he was acknowledging that in 2013, he and his fellow opposition members realized that the election process was so flawed, so illegal, that the only logical step withdraw. But they could not withdraw because they also realized that Zanu was offering a few seats to those who were willing to participate, and both MDCT and MDCN could not resist that bribe. So my argument here with people like Peter Mutasa, these are the influential members of society, the intellectuals, is that, are you telling me you are not aware of what is going on here? If somebody like you could be so ignorant of what is going on, what more of the ordinary people? These last elections, 2023 elections, Triple C, Nelson Chamisa and his friends insisted in participating in these flawed elections. Chamisa himself was claiming that he has devised ways of stopping Zanu PF rigging the elections. He has plugged all the Zanu PF voting loopholes. He was hell-bent on participating in these elections, knowing fully well that the process is flawed. So much so that he was inventing solutions, ways of stopping Zanu PF rigging the elections, knowing fully well that was just hot air. Even the regional bodies dismissed these elections as a fuss. But one of the reasons why I believe SADC was reluctant to take on Zanu PF and say to them, no, you rigged these elections, so you have no political legitimacy. I believe one of the reasons would have been that they, among themselves, must have asked themselves, if we do that, what is going to happen next? Do we have anybody in the opposition competent to lead the country? And if anyone, any Zimbabwean, being honest, if you see what is happening in the opposition right now, I think you'll have to be really brave to say that that is a sign of a competent opposition. Of course, there's nothing competent about what they're doing right now. What is worse, in my view, which SADC leaders have had also to take into consideration, is that even if we discount Zanu PF, discount the opposition Triple C, can we count on anybody in the opposition, in society in general, to really come up with a way out of this mess? And they would have been looking at leaders like Peter Mtaso. ZCTU is one of the big institutions in Zimbabwe, and therefore then will be considered to be one of the stakeholders. And as a leader himself of ZCTU, being former president of ZCTU, and now holding a senior position in another NGO, he would have been considered one of the competent leaders. But if they read something like this, if I was them, I'll be saying to myself, well, I don't think we've got anybody there. If after all these years, 23 years of MDC, Triple C, on the opposition platform, they failed to implement even one meaningful reform, not even one, and someone still thinks that they are doing their best. They are fighting Zanu PF. You despair. You honestly despair. I believe ignorance is our worst case in Zimbabwe. And I think if we do not take this challenge and confronting it and deal with it, there is, of course, the cure for it. Cure for ignorance is education. Going out there to be informed. It's not rocket science to understand what reforms are. It is not rocket science to understand that the primary purpose of the GNU was to implement the democratic reforms to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. It is not rocket science. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to realize that MDC failed to implement any of those reforms. And the simple reason for it is that Mugabe bribed them with the trappings of high office, and they forgot all about reforms. So many people who are queuing to praise MDC, Triple C, are actually individuals who just do not want to admit that Nelson Chamisa and company are corrupt and incompetent. They cannot bring themselves to say that. Well, that to me is deeply entrenched ignorance and stupidity. We in Zimbabwe have had rigged elections for the last 43 years. And for anyone to keep on participating in these flawed elections, to be enticed to give up implementing the democratic reforms and the right to free, fair, and credible elections on the promise that Nelson Chamisa has plugged all the vote rigging loopholes is, to me, a clear sign of somebody who is really refusing to think. Particularly after 43 years of Zanu PF rigging the elections. If we are serious about changing Zimbabwe, I think this is where we have got to start the fight to end the Zanu PF dictatorship. Deal with this curse of ignorance and stupidity. Particularly the stubborn ignorance of somebody who refuses to open their eyes, open their ears, and open their minds and see the mountain of evidence before you. We cannot pretend that Triple C will ever deliver any meaningful reforms and free and fair elections. If they wanted to, they would have done it. They had the golden opportunity to do so during the GNU. They did not. They've given up. They are participating in these elections for a share of the spoils of power. And giving Zanu PF legitimacy and thus perpetuating the dictatorship. It is naive, to say the least, to believe that Triple C are still fighting in the masses' corner to end the Zanu PF dictatorship. And I do not expect that kind of naivety from those who are in a position of leadership. This is one of the problems that we have had in Zimbabwe, where it's not only that people are not informed, but there are some who refuse to be informed, who refuse to accept reality. This is stubborn ignorance. The nation has paid dearly for that mistake. And I think it is high time we look ourselves in the mirror and say enough is enough. We are not going to have any meaningful democratic change in Zimbabwe as long as we pretend that the same failed, corrupt, and incompetent opposition leaders are going to deliver it. They are not going to deliver it. We should know that by now. We've got a mountain of evidence proving that they are not going to deliver that. And I think we must open our eyes and admit that to ourselves. Thank you very much for listening, and good night. I'm hoping that every evening at 6 o'clock UK time, I'll be able to address issues to do with Zimbabwe. And I think this number one issue is going to recur again and again. The amount of stick I've had for writing that article clearly shows that this is a serious problem. And I think one we should face head on. There is nothing, there is no one who's going to save Zimbabwe if we don't do it ourselves. And the starting point is being honest with ourselves. Is stop repeating the same stupid mistakes out of misplaced vanity. I don't know. I don't know whether it's vanity or stupidity. Whatever it is, we must confront it. And I hope you'll join me in confronting it. Thank you very much again for listening, and good night.